"You're in the wrong line, boys. Economy is back there." That's what the flight attendant sneered, pointing a manicured finger at two men holding valid first-class tickets. She didn't know she was speaking to the owners of the airline's biggest corporate partner. She didn't know they were twins billionaires and about to change her life forever. In the next 90 minutes, seats would be stolen, security would be threatened, and a single phone call would ground an entire flight crew permanently. But the real twist wasn't just about getting fired. It was about the lawsuit that followed, exposing a culture of discrimination that ruined careers and changed an entire industry. This is the story of the Cross brothers. Buckle up. The morning sun cast long shadows across the San Francisco penthouse office as Cameron Cross stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up 6 stories below. In his hand, he held a faded hospital bill dated 15 years ago, the paper worn soft from handling. Final notice. Payment due, $47,832.50. Patient Elena Cross. Services emergency cardiac treatment. Denied by insurance pending verification. His mother had died waiting for that verification. Still thinking about her, Dylan Cross emerged from behind a wall of quantum computing monitors, his fingers still dancing across holographic displays that showed real-time air traffic data flowing across 6 continents. The twins were identical in almost every way, except for a small scar above Cameron's left eyebrow, a childhood accident that made Dylan 3 minutes older in their mother's worried mind. Every morning before something important, Cameron admitted, carefully folding the bill back into his wallet. Today especially. This London contract isn't just another deal, D. It's the one that puts us in control of the entire global aviation logistics network. Dylan moved to stand beside his brother, both men reflecting in the glass like bookends of ambition and brilliance. At 34, they had already revolutionized air traffic management with quantum-powered algorithms that could process millions of flight calculations simultaneously. Their company, Quantum Logistics AI, had just been acquired by Global Aviation Systems for $8.2 billion, though the twins retained 60% control and all operational authority. Mom would have loved seeing this, Dylan said, his voice carrying the weight of old pain mixed with new pride. Her boys owning the skies she used to watch from that hospital window, talking about flying somewhere beautiful when she got better. Cameron touched the glass, leaving a brief fingerprint that caught the morning light. She died because a system decided her life wasn't worth the cost of proper care. Today we sign the contract that gives us the power to make sure transportation systems serve everyone equally, regardless of who they are or where they come from. The London meeting wasn't just about money, though there would be plenty of that. It was about finalizing their revolutionary air traffic management system that would integrate with every major airline's operations, giving Quantum unprecedented influence over global aviation. But more than that, it represented validation in a world that had spent their entire lives questioning whether 2 young black men from Oakland really belonged in Silicon Valley's highest circles. Dylan pulled up the flight information on his tablet. Their business class seats confirmed on Global Air Flight 847 departing JFK at 5:30 p.m. First class was sold out when Marcus made the booking. Last month, he explained, referring to their longtime executive assistant. But he managed to get us 2A and 2B. Not quite the presidential suite, but close enough. First-class coach cargo hold. Cameron shrugged, turning away from the window. Doesn't matter where we sit. What matters is where we end up. But even as he said it, he felt that familiar tension that came with entering spaces where their presence was unexpected, questioned, or simply unwelcome. They had learned early that success didn't automatically translate to acceptance. Cameron remembered the venture capital meetings where investors looked past them to search for the real founders. Dylan still carried the business cards from conferences where people assumed they were security guards or maintenance staff rather than the keynote speakers. "You know what I love about our work?" Dylan asked, gathering their travel documents. Code doesn't see color. Algorithms don't care about accents or zip codes or whether your parents went to Harvard. You write something that works, and it works for everyone. If only people were like Code. Cameron replied, checking his watch. They had a 2:00 p.m. departure from San Francisco to catch their connecting flight at JFK, ready to go change the world. Already changed it. Dylan smiled, but there was steel underneath. Now, we're just making sure everyone knows it. The drive to the airport was quiet, both brothers lost in their own thoughts about the magnitude of what lay ahead. Their mother Elena had been a mathematics teacher who filled their childhood with puzzles, patterns, and the belief that logic could solve any problem. She had died believing her sons would do something extraordinary with their gifts, though she never lived to see them prove her right. As their car pulled up to the private aviation terminal at San Francisco International, Cameron felt the familiar mix of excitement and apprehension that came with high-stakes travel. In 18 hours, they would either return as the undisputed leaders of global aviation technology, or they would have lost the biggest opportunity of their lives to competitors who didn't share their vision of equitable access and fair treatment. "Whatever happens in London," Dylan said as they stepped onto the tarmac, "we do this for her." Cameron nodded, touching his wallet where their mother's hospital bill rested like a promise waiting to be kept. The morning fog was already burning off, revealing clear skies ahead. The Platinum Elite Lounge at JFK Terminal 4 hummed with the quiet efficiency of privilege, where conversations about multi-million-dollar deals competed with the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the rustle of financial newspapers. The air smelled of expensive leather chairs, fresh orchids, and that particular scent of exclusivity that money bought in places designed to keep ordinary people on the other side of frosted glass doors. Cameron and Dylan Cross entered the lounge at 2:15 p.m., their boarding passes already scanned and verified by the automated system at the entrance. They wore what had become their signature-style premium streetwear that cost more than most people's monthly salaries, but looked casual enough to draw assumptions. Dylan's limited-edition sneakers had cost $4,000 and were one of only 50 pairs made worldwide. Cameron's vintage hoodie was custom-tailored cashmere that felt like wearing a cloud. To the trained eye of someone who understood real wealth, they looked exactly like what they were, young tech billionaires who had earned the right to dress however they wanted. To the untrained eye of someone who made judgments based on appearances and old prejudices, they looked like trouble. Sandra Blackwood noticed them immediately. 20 years with Global Air had taught her to read passengers the moment they walked through her domain, and she prided herself on maintaining standards in what she considered the last bastion of civilized air travel. At 48, she had worked her way up from economy cabin service to senior first-class attendant to her current position as VIP lounge supervisor, and she protected her territory with the fierce devotion of someone who had earned every inch of authority. Sandra had served royalty tech titans, oil sheiks, and movie stars, but she had also perfected the art of identifying passengers who didn't quite fit her mental image of first-class material. These two young men, despite having valid boarding passes, triggered every one of her carefully calibrated warning systems. She approached their table with the practiced smile she had perfected over 2 decades, the expression that could convey either warm welcome or polite dismissal, depending on the situation. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying that specific tone of customer service politeness that could freeze or thaw at will. "I need to verify your boarding documentation. We're conducting random security checks today due to heightened protocols." It was a lie, and everyone in the immediate vicinity knew it was a lie. The businessman at the adjacent table lowered his newspaper slightly, watching the interaction with the uncomfortable fascination of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. The elderly woman near the window stopped stirring her tea, her spoon suspended in midair as she strained to hear without appearing to eavesdrop. Cameron looked up from his tablet where he had been reviewing final contract details for their London meeting. His expression remained neutral, but Dylan recognized the slight tightening around his brother's eyes that meant his patience was being tested. "We scanned in at the entrance," Cameron said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had dealt with this particular form of scrutiny more times than he cared to count. "The system verified our credentials automatically." "I understand that," Sandra replied, extending her hand with the expectation of immediate compliance, "but I need to see physical boarding passes for manual verification. These random checks are mandatory for all passengers today." Dylan slid his sunglasses down his nose, revealing eyes that carried both amusement and annoyance in equal measure. "All passengers?" he asked, making a subtle gesture toward the other travelers in the lounge, none of whom had been subjected to Sandra's sudden security protocols, or just certain passengers who don't fit your usual profile. The question hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone but impossible to grab directly. Sandra felt her cheeks flush slightly, recognizing that she had been called out, but unable to acknowledge the truth without admitting to behavior that would cost her job if reported to management. "I don't appreciate the implication," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "I follow standard security protocols without regard to passenger demographics. Now, may I please see your boarding passes immediately?" Cameron reached into his jacket and withdrew his phone, displaying his mobile boarding pass with the kind of patience that suggested he had performed this dance many times before. The screen clearly showed his name, seat assignment, 2A first-class service, and a confirmation number that proved he had paid full fare for his ticket. Dylan followed suit, showing seat 2B with the same credentials. Both boarding passes displayed the distinctive gold header that indicated premium full-fare first-class passengers, the kind of tickets that cost $12,000 each and represented the airline's most profitable customer segment. Sandra stared at the screens, her eyes scanning for any irregularity that might justify her suspicions. The names Cameron Cross and Dylan Cross meant nothing to her, despite the fact that their faces had appeared on the covers of both Fortune and Forbes magazines within the past 6 months. She saw expensive phones displaying legitimate tickets, but her mind couldn't reconcile the image of these two young black men with her preconceived notions of first-class passengers. "These appear to be in order," she admitted reluctantly, making no move to apologize for the unnecessary verification. "However, I should mention that we have some VIP passengers traveling today, including Mr. Theodore Worthington III, who has been a loyal Global Air customer for over 30 years. I trust there won't be any issues with your flight experience." The warning was subtle but unmistakable. "Behave yourselves because important people are watching." Cameron and Dylan exchanged a glance that conveyed an entire conversation, without words. The kind of silent communication that came from spending a lifetime navigating rooms where their presence was questioned before their credentials were verified. "We appreciate the information," Cameron replied, his voice carrying just enough edge to make clear that he understood the subtext perfectly. "We'll be sure to maintain appropriate standards throughout our flight experience." As Sandra walked away, her heels clicking against the marble floor with obvious irritation, Dylan leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. "Some things never change, do they? Doesn't matter how much money you have or how many times your picture appears in business magazines. Some people will always see what they want to see." Cameron returned to his tablet, but his focus had shifted from contract details to something deeper and more personal. "She doesn't know who we are," he said quietly. "But in about 3 hours she's going to find out. And when she does, this conversation is going to feel very different to her than it does right now." Neither brother could have predicted how prophetic those words would prove to be. At 3:45 p.m., the boarding area outside Gate 12 buzzed with the controlled chaos of international departure preparations. But Sandra Blackwood's attention was focused on damage control rather than passenger service. She stood near the gate podium watching Theodore Worthington III pace back and forth like a caged predator, his face growing redder with each circuit around the waiting area. Theodore was everything Sandra understood wealth to look like, 65 years old. silver-haired, wearing a hand-tailored Savile Row suit that cost more than most people's cars, and carrying himself with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted in his entire life. His family's shipping empire had built half the ports on the eastern seaboard, and he flew this exact route to London twice monthly for business that kept generations of lawyers and accountants employed. "This is completely unacceptable," Sandra Theodore was saying, his voice carrying the particular tone of outrage that came from old money encountering unexpected resistance. "Seat 2. A has been my preference for 15 years. I specifically requested it when my assistant made this booking, and now you're telling me it's unavailable because of some computer error?" Sandra glanced toward the lounge where Cameron and Dylan Cross sat quietly, completely unaware that they had become the center of a brewing storm. In her mind, the mathematics of customer service was simple. Theodore represented decades of loyalty, hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual revenue, and the kind of passenger testimonial that could make or break her performance reviews. The Cross brothers, despite their legitimate tickets, were unknown quantities who might never fly Global Air again. "Mr. Worthington," she said, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial tone she reserved for managing difficult situations. "I want you to know that I'm personally committed to resolving this matter to your complete satisfaction. Those seats were booking through our online system by passengers who may not fully understand our customer hierarchy protocols." It was careful language that danced around the truth, while implying that Cameron and Dylan had somehow gamed the system or taken advantage of a technical glitch. Theodore's expression shifted from outrage to the satisfied smile of someone who sensed victory approaching. "I knew you would handle this appropriately," he said, adjusting his platinum cufflinks with the kind of casual gesture that revealed their astronomical cost. "Margaret and I have dinner reservations at Claridge's at 8 tomorrow evening, and we simply cannot arrive in London feeling rattled by substandard travel experiences." Sandra nodded with the understanding of someone who had spent 2 decades translating entitled demands into actionable solutions. "Leave this with me, Mr. Worthington. I'll handle the seating reassignment once we board the aircraft. These situations are always easier to manage in the controlled environment of the cabin rather than the chaos of the gate area." The plan was elegant in its simplicity and cruel in its execution. She would allow Cameron and Dylan to board normally, letting them settle into their seats and begin to relax. Then, once the aircraft door closed and alternatives became limited, she would approach them with revised seating assignments that moved them to economy class, while allowing Theodore to claim what he considered his rightful place in 2A. It was a strategy Sandra had employed before with passengers she deemed less important, and it had always worked, because most people, when faced with the choice between public confrontation and quiet compliance, chose to avoid the scene. Economy passengers rarely challenged airline authority because they understood their position in the food chain of air travel. But Sandra's experience had been limited to ordinary passengers facing ordinary circumstances. She had never tried to relocate tech billionaires who owned the software that kept airplanes flying. The boarding announcement crackled over the gate speakers at exactly 4:20 p.m., and Sandra watched with satisfaction as Theodore and his wife Margaret made their way down the jet bridge with the unhurried confidence of people who knew their seats would be waiting exactly as expected. She had given them a 5-minute head start to settle into 2A and 2B before the general boarding process began. Cameron and Dylan followed 15 minutes later, walking with the easy stride of frequent travelers who had learned to navigate airports efficiently. They moved through the jet bridge, chatting quietly about their upcoming presentation, completely unaware that their evening was about to become significantly more complicated than a simple business flight. The Boeing 777-300ER was Global Air's flagship aircraft, a $300 million showcase of luxury engineering that featured lie-flat seats and first-class premium leather throughout the cabin, and enough technology to stream live television from 35,000 feet. The first-class section contained only 8 seats arranged in a 2-2 configuration, creating an intimate environment where every passenger interaction was visible to everyone else. As Cameron and Dylan entered the cabin, they immediately saw Theodore Worthington III settled comfortably in seat 2. His jacket already hung in the closet, his shoes kicked off, and a pre-departure champagne glass balanced on his armrest. His wife, Margaret, occupied seat 2B, clutching her designer handbag with the nervous energy of someone who preferred to avoid conflict but understood her role in supporting her husband's expectations. Cameron stopped in the aisle, checking his boarding pass for the 3rd time to make sure he hadn't misread the seat assignment. The mobile display clearly showed seat 2A purchased 6 weeks earlier when their executive assistant had booked their London travel arrangements. He took a deep breath, recognizing the situation for what it was, but hoping it might be resolved quickly and quietly. "Excuse me," Cameron said, approaching Theodore with the kind of polite firmness that suggested he was accustomed to resolving misunderstandings through reasonable conversation. "I believe you may be in my seat. I have 2A reserved, and my brother has 2B. Theodore looked up from his champagne with the expression of someone who had been interrupted while enjoying a particularly fine wine. He didn't look at Cameron's boarding pass or offer any suggestion that this might be an innocent mistake requiring mutual problem-solving. Instead, he smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who had been expecting this exact confrontation and was prepared to enjoy it. Young man Theodore said, his voice carrying decades of practice in dismissing people he considered beneath his attention. "I think you'll find there's been some sort of error with your ticketing. These seats are clearly occupied by their rightful passengers." The word rightful hung in the air like a challenge loaded with implications that went far beyond simple seat assignments and into territory that made every other passenger in first class suddenly very uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. The tension in the first-class cabin shifted from uncomfortable to electric as Cameron Cross stood in the aisle, his boarding pass still displayed on his phone screen, while Theodore Worthington III smiled up at him with the kind of condescending patience usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to children. "I'm sorry," Cameron said, his voice remaining level despite the obvious provocation, "but there seems to be some confusion. These seats were purchased and confirmed 6 weeks ago. I can show you the confirmation email, the credit card charge, even the upgrade notification when we were moved from business class to first class." "That's quite unnecessary," Theodore replied, waving his hand dismissively while taking another sip of champagne. "I'm sure whatever booking agent you dealt with will be able to sort this out for you. Perhaps there are some nice seats available in premium economy where you'll be more comfortable with other passengers who share your background." The pause before background was deliberate and loaded with exactly the kind of meaning that everyone in the cabin understood, but no one could officially challenge without seeming to read something inappropriate into what could technically be interpreted as an innocent comment about ticket class or travel experience. Dylan moved to stand beside his brother, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "Our background?" he asked, his voice carrying a warning edge that suggested Theodore was approaching a line he might not want to cross. "What exactly do you know about our background?" Before Theodore could respond, Sandra Blackwood appeared from the galley with the theatrical timing of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. She carried a small tablet and wore the expression of airline authority ready to resolve an unfortunate situation through the application of proper procedures. "Gentlemen," she said, addressing Cameron and Dylan while completely ignoring Theodore, "apologize for the confusion, but we've had to make some last-minute adjustments to accommodate our premium loyalty members. I have new seat assignments that will resolve this situation immediately." She handed Cameron a printed boarding pass that showed seat 34E located in the economy section near the back of the aircraft. Dylan received an identical pass for 34F, the middle seat in a row of 3 that would require him to ask strangers to move every time he needed to use the restroom. The insult was precise and calculated from the spaciousness and luxury of first-class seats 2A and 2B to cramped economy seats in row 34, a journey from the front of the plane to the very back that would take them past every other passenger on the aircraft. It wasn't just a downgrade. It was a public humiliation designed to send a clear message about their place in the airline's hierarchy. "This is a joke, right?" Dylan said, looking at the economy boarding pass as if it might transform into something reasonable through the force of his disbelief. "You're moving us from first class to the back of the plane to accommodate someone who doesn't even have a reservation for these seats, mister. Worthington is a Diamond Elite member with over 30 years of loyal service," Sandra replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining obvious facts to unreasonable people. "Our policy clearly states that accommodation adjustments may be necessary to ensure our most valued customers receive appropriate service levels." It was corporate speak designed to make discrimination sound like customer service, wrapping prejudice in the language of policies and procedures that could defend any decision as long as it was presented with sufficient authority and official documentation. Cameron felt something cold and focused settling in his chest, the same feeling he got when debugging particularly complex code that required systematic analysis rather than emotional reaction. He looked at Sandra, then at Theodore, then at the economy boarding passes, processing the entire situation with the kind of methodical thinking that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in Silicon Valley. I see Cameron said, his voice becoming unnaturally calm in the way that made Dylan immediately recognize his brother was shifting from annoyed to dangerously angry. "So your policy is that legitimate ticket holders can be moved to accommodate passenger preferences based on what you consider appropriate service levels." "That's a simplified interpretation," Sandra began, but Cameron cut her off with a gesture. "No, I think I understand perfectly." Cameron folded the economy boarding pass and slipped it into his pocket. "You've made your position very clear. We'll take the new seats." Dylan stared at his brother in complete shock. They had paid $12,000 each for first-class tickets. They had every legal right to the seats they had reserved, and Cameron was simply giving up without a fight. It went against everything Dylan knew about his brother's personality and their shared commitment to never accepting unfair treatment. "Jay, what are you doing?" Dylan whispered urgently. "We don't have to take this. We can call the airline management. We can demand to speak to the captain. We can take our assigned seats." Cameron interrupted, his voice carrying a tone Dylan had heard only a few times before, usually right before his brother did something that fundamentally changed the game being played around them. "Row 34 seats E and F. Come on." Theodore Worthington III settled back into seat 2A with visible satisfaction, raising his champagne glass in a subtle toast to his victory over passengers he considered interlopers who had been properly put in their place. "Good choice, boys," he called out as they began walking toward the back of the aircraft. "Long walk to the cheap seats, but I'm sure you'll find some people more like yourselves back there." The comment was loud enough for every passenger in first class to hear, and uncomfortable enough to make several people suddenly find their magazines or phones intensely interesting. One woman in seat 4. A actually gasped audibly, while a businessman in 3C shook his head in obvious dismay at what he was witnessing. But Cameron just smiled, and Dylan recognized that particular expression with growing alarm. It was the same smile his brother wore when he had found a fatal flaw in a competitor's algorithm or discovered a security vulnerability that could bring down an entire network. It was the smile of someone who had just realized he held all the cards in a game where his opponents didn't even know what cards existed. As they walked toward economy class, Dylan leaned close to his brother and whispered urgently, "Whatever you're thinking, remember we have the London meeting tomorrow. We can't afford to miss that flight." Cameron's smile widened slightly. "Don't worry about the London meeting," he said quietly. "We'll get there. But this flight isn't going anywhere until some people learn exactly who they're dealing with." Row 34 was everything that first class was not cramped, noisy, and filled with the particular combination of recycled air, crying children, and bathroom proximity that made international travel feel like an endurance test rather than a luxury experience. Cameron and Dylan, both standing 6 feet 3 inches tall, found their knees jammed against the seats in front of them as they attempted to settle into spaces designed for people several inches shorter and significantly less prosperous. The contrast was jarring and obviously intentional. In first class, they would have had seats that converted into full beds, personal storage compartments, and enough space to work comfortably on laptops throughout the 7-hour flight to London. Here in row 34, they could barely open their phones without elbowing the passengers beside them. Dylan was seething, his usual calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled rage as he struggled with his seatbelt while listening to a baby crying 3 rows ahead and feeling the vibration of passengers using the bathroom directly behind them. "This is insane," he muttered loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear. "We paid $24,000 for first-class tickets, and they moved us back here to accommodate some racist old man who doesn't even have reservations for those seats." "Keep your voice down," Cameron said, but his tone suggested he was thinking about something entirely different from passenger comfort or airline policies. He had pulled out his phone and was scrolling through what appeared to be a simple black screen with green text, the kind of interface that meant nothing to most people but would be instantly recognizable to anyone with advanced computer programming experience. Several passengers in nearby seats had begun paying attention to their conversation, particularly a young man in seat 35A who had been glancing at Cameron periodically since they sat down. He was maybe 22 years old, wearing a Stanford University sweatshirt and the kind of thick-rimmed glasses that suggested serious study habits rather than fashion choices. "Excuse me," the young man said, leaning forward with the nervous energy of someone working up courage to approach celebrities, "but are you Cameron and Dylan Cross from Quantum Logistics?" Cameron looked up from his phone, focusing on the student for the first time. "Yeah, that's us. Sorry, do we know each other?" "Alex." "Chen." The young man introduced himself, his voice carrying the excitement of meeting personal heroes. "I'm a computer science major at Stanford, and I've been following your work since your first published papers on quantum traffic optimization. I was actually at your keynote presentation at the International Aviation Technology Conference last year." Dylan's expression shifted from anger to curiosity. "You were at IATC. That was a pretty technical conference for an undergraduate student. I won a scholarship to attend," Alex explained proudly. "Your presentation on real-time flight path optimization using quantum algorithms was incredible. You showed how traditional systems were wasting billions of dollars annually through inefficient routing calculations." Cameron felt a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "What did you think of our demonstration showing how quantum processing could prevent delays by predicting weather pattern interactions 18 hours in advance?" "Mind-blowing," Alex said immediately. "But what really impressed me was your point about how these systems could democratize air travel by making flights more affordable through efficiency gains. Most tech presentations focus on profits, but you talked about access and equity." It was exactly the kind of conversation that reminded Cameron why he had gotten into technology in the first place, the potential to solve complex problems that affected millions of people while creating opportunities for those who had been historically excluded from the benefits of innovation. That's because technology should serve everyone. Dylan said, his anger beginning to transform into something more focused and purposeful. Unfortunately, not everyone in the aviation industry shares that philosophy, as we're discovering tonight. Alex looked confused for a moment. Then his expression changed as he processed their current location in the economy section despite being dressed in obviously expensive clothing and carrying themselves like successful executives. "Wait, why are you sitting back here? Shouldn't you be in first class for a flight like this?" "We were," Cameron said, his voice carrying a tone that made Alex lean forward to hear better over the ambient noise of the economy cabin. We had seats 2A and 2B purchased 6 weeks ago, but the flight attendant decided we didn't look like appropriate first-class passengers and moved us back here to accommodate a passenger who apparently fits their idea of who belongs in premium seats." "You're kidding," Alex said, his voice rising with disbelief. "They moved you based on appearance. Don't they know who you are?" "Apparently not," Dylan replied. "And apparently it doesn't matter. According to the flight attendant, 30 years of customer loyalty trumps legitimate reservations when it comes to passengers who don't match expected demographics." Alex pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen with the speed of someone who had grown up communicating primarily through digital means. "This is incredibly messed up," he said, holding up his device. "I'm starting a live stream. People need to see this." Cameron held up a hand, stopping Alex before he could begin recording. "Hold that thought for a few minutes. I'm currently working on resolving this situation through alternative means, and I want to make sure we have the complete story before we involve social media." "Alternative means?" Alex asked, intrigued by Cameron's confident tone, despite their obviously disadvantaged position. Cameron returned his attention to his phone, where lines of code were scrolling past at a speed that suggested either automated processes or extremely fast manual input. "Let's just say that when you design the logistics software that keeps airplanes flying on schedule, you tend to have certain administrative privileges that most passengers don't enjoy." Dylan recognized the particular type of focused concentration that meant his brother was accessing systems that existed far beyond ordinary passenger awareness. "Jay, please tell me you're not doing what I think you're doing. I'm implementing a safety protocol review for this specific aircraft," Cameron said, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone he used when explaining complex technical concepts to non-technical audiences. According to Federal Aviation Administration regulations, any flight crew that demonstrates bias in passenger treatment represents a potential safety risk that must be addressed before departure. Authorization can be granted. Alex looked back and forth between the twins, his computer science background giving him just enough understanding to realize he was witnessing something unprecedented. "You can actually do that. You can prevent the plane from taking off. The Quantum Logistics Platform Processes. Departure authorization for 93% of commercial aviation in North America," Cameron explained, still typing. "When safety concerns are flagged in the system, aircraft are automatically grounded, pending investigation and resolution." "But won't that affect hundreds of passengers?" Alex asked suddenly, understanding the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Cameron paused in his typing and looked around the economy cabin, taking in the families traveling to see relatives, the business travelers with important meetings, the students heading to study abroad programs. Every passenger on this aircraft paid for respectful treatment as part of their ticket price. If the crew can discriminate against legitimate ticket holders without consequences, then every passenger is at risk of similar treatment. Plus, Dylan added with a grim smile, "We're about to give everyone a very educational demonstration of what happens when you mistake the people who control aviation technology for passengers who can be pushed around without consequences." Cameron's phone chimed softly, indicating that whatever process he had initiated was now complete. Implementation finished, he announced, sliding the device back into his pocket. "Now we wait approximately 4 minutes for the system to process the crew safety review request." "And then what happens?" Alex asked, his excitement obvious, despite his nervousness about the potential consequences. "Then the real fun begins," Cameron said, leaning back in his cramped economy seat with the relaxed confidence of someone who had just activated the nuclear option and was now simply waiting for the explosion. At exactly 5:27 p.m., 3 minutes ahead of Cameron's prediction, the Boeing 777-300ER shuddered slightly as its Pratt & Whitney engines began to wind down from their pre-departure power setting. The sound was subtle at first, like a giant mechanical sigh, but within seconds it became obvious that something was very wrong with Global Air Flight 847. In the cockpit, Captain Victoria Ashford was staring at her primary flight display with the kind of confusion that comes from seeing something that should be impossible according to 22 years of commercial aviation experience. The screen was showing a bright red warning message she had never encountered before. Crew authorization invalid. Departure denied pending safety review. "What the hell does that mean?" asked First Officer Michael Torres, looking over at his own displays, which showed identical error messages across every navigation and communication system. "I've never seen this warning before." The pre-flight checklist came back clean. Ground control cleared us for pushback, and now suddenly we're invalid. Captain Ashford reached for her radio to contact Global Air Operations. But before she could speak, every computer system in the cockpit simultaneously displayed a new message that made her blood run cold. Aircraft safety protocol activated. Quantum logistics platform. Contact operations immediately. Quantum logistics. Torres said, his voice rising with concern. "Isn't that the company that runs our scheduling and routing software?" "It runs everything," Captain Ashford replied, grabbing the operations manual and flipping through pages she hadn't needed to reference in years. "Flight planning, crew assignments, maintenance schedules, even our passenger manifests. If Quantum is flagging a safety issue, we're not going anywhere until it's resolved." Back in economy class, Cameron was watching his phone display real-time system notifications that confirmed his intervention was working exactly as designed. The Quantum platform had received his safety protocol request, cross-referenced it with the crew roster and passenger manifest, and determined that discriminatory crew behavior represented a potential safety hazard requiring immediate ground hold. "It's working," Cameron said quietly to Dylan and Alex, who were watching him with fascination and growing excitement. "The system has flagged this flight for crew bias review, which automatically triggers a departure hold until the issue is investigated and resolved." Alex was recording everything on his phone, live streaming to his social media followers, who were beginning to understand they were witnessing something unprecedented in commercial aviation history. His viewer count had already climbed past 1,500 and was accelerating as word spread about billionaire tech founders being racially profiled by airline staff. "This is incredible," Alex whispered to his phone camera, narrating the situation for his growing audience. Cameron Cross just used his own company's software to ground an entire flight after being discriminated against by the crew. We're sitting in economy class watching him hack the aviation system in real time. Up in first class, Theodore Worthington III was becoming increasingly agitated as the engines continued to power down instead of spooling up for takeoff. He pressed his call button repeatedly, demanding answers from Sandra Blackwood, who was rushing between the cockpit and passenger cabin trying to understand why her routine flight was suddenly turning into a crisis. "What do you mean we can't depart?" Theodore was saying, his voice loud enough to be heard throughout the first-class cabin. "I have a dinner reservation at Claridge's tomorrow evening, and I absolutely cannot afford delays. This is completely unacceptable service." Sandra was struggling to maintain her professional composure while dealing with a situation that was completely outside her training and experience. "Sir, we're experiencing a technical delay related to our computer systems. The captain is working to resolve it immediately." "Technical delay?" Theodore scoffed. "This airline has gotten completely unreliable. Maybe I should reconsider my loyalty to Global Air if this is the kind of service I can expect." In the cockpit, Captain Ashford was on the radio with Global Air Operations trying to understand why their most critical systems had suddenly locked them out of departure authorization. The conversation was increasingly frustrating as operations control seemed just as confused as the flight crew. "Operations, this is Global Air 847. Captain Ashford said, her voice tight with professional concern. "We're showing crew authorization invalid across all systems. I need immediate technical support and an explanation of why quantum logistics is blocking our departure." 847. "This is operations," came the response. "We're seeing the same error codes on our end." According to Quantum's automated system, there's been a safety protocol violation flagged for your crew, but we don't have details about the specific nature of the issue. Safety protocol violation. Captain Ashford repeated, her voice rising with alarm. What kind of violation? My crew completed all required training. We are current on all certifications and we passed our pre-flight briefings without any issues. The system isn't specifying. Operations replied, sounding increasingly helpless. It just shows a generic safety review request that requires administrative override from Quantum Logistics directly. You'll need to contact their technical support line for resolution. Meanwhile, other passengers throughout the aircraft were beginning to notice that something was seriously wrong. Departure time had passed 15 minutes ago. The engines had shut down completely, and the cabin temperature was beginning to rise as the environmental system switched to ground power that wasn't designed to maintain comfort for extended periods. In seat 43C, a business traveler named Jennifer Walsh was live tweeting the delay to her followers, unknowingly spreading word of the situation to thousands of people who were beginning to connect the dots between airline discrimination stories and unusual flight delays. Stuck on at Global Air flight to London, she typed, "Engines shut down after boarding crew looks panicked, and I just heard some passengers talking about being moved from first class for racial reasons. This is getting very weird, very fast." Back in row 34, Cameron was receiving automated updates on his phone as the Quantum system processed his safety review request through its standard protocols. The platform had already flagged Sandra Blackwood's crew assignment for review, noting discrepancies between her stated customer service policies and her actual passenger treatment patterns. "How long until they figure out it was you?" Dylan asked, watching his brother monitor the cascade of system responses that were bringing one of the world's largest airlines to a complete standstill. "They won't figure it out," Cameron replied, scrolling through status updates that showed the review process working exactly as designed. The system shows an automated safety flag triggered by algorithmic analysis of crew behavior patterns. It looks like artificial intelligence identifying potential discrimination risks, not human intervention, which it technically is. Alex observed his computer science background, helping him understand the elegance of Cameron's approach. "You just told the AI what to look for." Cameron nodded, slipping his phone back into his pocket as he noticed Sandra Blackwood hurrying down the aisle toward economy class, her face flushed with stress and her professional composure beginning to crack under pressure. And now Cameron said, settling back in his uncomfortable economy seat with the satisfied expression of someone watching a perfectly executed plan unfold, "We see how long it takes them to realize that their discrimination problem just became everyone's problem." Sandra Blackwood's march toward economy class row 34 was the walk of someone whose carefully controlled world was collapsing in real time, and who desperately needed someone to blame for circumstances that were spiraling completely beyond her management or understanding. Her 20-year career with Global Air had never prepared her for a situation where passenger complaints could apparently crash entire computer systems and ground aircraft indefinitely. She stopped at row 34 with the rigid posture of authority under siege, looking down at Cameron and Dylan with barely concealed suspicion and growing desperation. Around them, economy passengers were becoming increasingly agitated as the cabin temperature continued to rise, and departure delays stretched past the 30-minute mark without explanation. "Gentlemen," Sandra said, her voice carrying forced politeness that barely concealed mounting panic, "I need you to power down all electronic devices immediately. The captain has reported signal interference that may be related to unauthorized device usage in the passenger cabin." It was an accusation wrapped in technical language implying that Cameron and Dylan were somehow responsible for the aircraft's computer failures through their phone usage. Several nearby passengers turned to stare, and Alex Chen quickly repositioned his phone to capture the confrontation he sensed was about to escalate dramatically. Cameron looked up at Sandra with expression of mild curiosity, as if her request was merely an interesting puzzle rather than a direct challenge to his authority. "Signal interference. he asked, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a confused student. From passenger devices. That's curious, considering modern aircraft are specifically designed to prevent such interference, and the FAA requires extensive testing to ensure passenger electronics can't affect flight systems. I'm not here to debate technical specifications. Sandra snapped her professional mask, slipping to reveal the stress and fear underneath. I'm instructing you to power down your devices immediately, or I'll be forced to classify this as a security threat and have you removed from the aircraft. Dylan leaned forward, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something much more dangerous. Removed for what exactly? Using phones that the airline explicitly allows during ground operations? Or are you suggesting we're somehow responsible for your aircraft's computer problems? What I'm suggesting, Sandra said, her voice rising loud enough to draw attention from passengers several rows away, is that you comply with crew instructions immediately or face the consequences of your continued disruption of normal flight operations. The word disruption hung in the air like an accusation that went far beyond technical concerns and into territory that made everyone within earshot uncomfortable with its obvious implications. Alex Chen's livestream viewer count was climbing past 5,000 as word spread across social media about the confrontation unfolding in real time. Cameron slowly pulled out his phone, holding it up so Sandra could see the black screen with green text that meant nothing to her but represented complete control over the aviation system that was currently holding her aircraft hostage. You want to discuss signal interference? Cameron asked, his voice remaining unnaturally calm. Let me show you what actual signal interference looks like. He tapped his screen once, and immediately Sandra's radio crackled with an automated message that made her face go pale. Global Air Operations, this is Quantum Logistics Platform. Aircraft 847 crew safety review has been escalated to executive level. Please contact Dr. Victoria Ashford immediately. Dr. Victoria Ashford, Sandra repeated, her voice barely audible. The CEO of Global Air. Why would she be involved in a computer glitch? Because it's not a computer glitch, Cameron replied, standing up from his cramped economy seat with fluid motion that somehow made him seem much taller and more imposing than the confined space should have allowed. It's a safety protocol activation triggered by discriminatory crew behavior that violates both Federal Aviation Administration anti-bias regulations and your own company's stated customer service policies. Sandra stared at him with growing horror as the implications of what he was saying began to penetrate her understanding. You can't be serious. You're claiming you triggered our computer problems. I'm not claiming anything, Cameron said, pulling up a contact list on his phone that showed names Sandra recognized from Global Air's executive directory. I'm simply noting that when passengers who happen to own aviation logistics companies are subjected to racial discrimination, those companies' safety systems tend to respond exactly as designed. Dylan stood beside his brother, and together they created an imposing presence that made other passengers begin to understand they were witnessing something unprecedented in commercial aviation history. You own an aviation logistics company? Sandra whispered, her voice barely audible above the increasingly agitated conversations of stranded passengers throughout the cabin. We own the aviation logistics company, Dylan corrected her. Quantum Logistics. AI provides scheduling, routing, and safety oversight for 93% of North American commercial aviation, including 100% of Global Air's fleet operations. Alex Chen's phone was capturing every word of the conversation while his viewer count climbed past 10,000, and comments were flooding in from viewers who were beginning to research Cameron and Dylan Cross and discover exactly who Sandra had decided to discriminate against. Cameron touched a contact labeled Victoria Ashford, CEO Direct Line, and held up his phone so Sandra could see the name on the screen. Since you've elevated this to a security matter involving supposed signal interference and passenger removal, I think it's appropriate to discuss the situation with your company's chief executive officer. No, wait, Sandra said, her voice cracking with panic. That's completely unnecessary. I'm sure we can resolve this situation without involving executive management. You're absolutely right that we can resolve this, Cameron agreed, putting the phone to his ear as it began to ring. But since you've already involved aircraft safety systems and threatened passenger removal, we're well beyond the point where this can be handled at the crew level. The phone rang twice before a crisp British accent answered with the kind of authority that comes from running a multi-billion-dollar international corporation. Cameron Cross, Victoria Ashford's voice said loud enough for Sandra and nearby passengers to hear clearly. I wasn't expecting to hear from you until you landed in London tomorrow morning. Is everything all right with your travel? Cameron looked directly at Sandra as he replied, Hello, Victoria. I'm currently sitting in economy class on your Flight 847 from JFK to Heathrow, having been moved from our confirmed first-class seats to accommodate a passenger your crew determined was more appropriate for premium service. The silence on the other end of the line was so profound that Sandra could actually hear her own heart beating while she waited for the response that she already knew would end her career. Excuse me. Victoria's voice had shifted from friendly greeting to something cold and dangerous. Did you just say you were moved from confirmed first-class seats based on crew discretion, about passenger appropriateness? That's exactly what I said, Cameron replied, his eyes never leaving Sandra's face. Your senior flight attendant. Ms. Sandra Blackwood determined that my brother and I didn't fit the appropriate profile for first-class passengers, and relocated us to economy class to accommodate a passenger she considered more suitable for premium service. Put Ms. Blackwood on the phone, Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that could make executives 3 levels below her tremble with fear. Immediately. Sandra's hands were shaking as Cameron held out his phone toward her with the expression of someone who had just checkmate in a game his opponent didn't realize she was playing. Sandra Blackwood took Cameron's phone with hands that trembled visibly, knowing that the conversation she was about to have would either be the most embarrassing moment of her career or the end of it entirely. Victoria Ashford's voice came through the speaker with the clarity and authority of someone accustomed to having her words treated as absolute law. Ms. Blackwood Victoria began her British accent carrying the kind of icy politeness that was somehow more terrifying than shouting, I need you to explain to me very carefully how my company's most important technology partners ended up in economy class, while someone without confirmed reservations occupied their paid first-class seats. Ma'am Sandra began, her voice cracking slightly as she tried to find words that might salvage her position. There was a misunderstanding about customer service priorities. Mr. Worthington is a Diamond Elite member with 30 years of loyalty, and I made a judgment call about accommodation protocols based on established passenger hierarchy guidelines. Passenger hierarchy guidelines. Victoria repeated, her voice dropping to the kind of dangerous quiet that made seasoned executives check their resumes. Are you telling me that you moved confirmed first-class passengers to economy class based on what you considered appropriate hierarchy? Sandra looked around, desperately seeing hundreds of passengers watching her humiliation while Alex Chen's livestream broadcast her destruction to thousands of viewers worldwide. The first-class cabin felt like a courtroom where she was being tried for crimes she had never realized she was committing. The situation was complicated, Sandra said weakly. Mr. Worthington specifically requested seats 2A and 2B, and as a long-standing customer with significant account value, I felt it was appropriate to accommodate his preferences through standard reseating procedures. Standard reseating procedures, Victoria said, each word dropping like a stone into still water, do not include moving confirmed passengers to accommodate unconfirmed requests. But more importantly, Ms. Blackwood, do you have any idea who you moved to accommodate Mr. Worthington's preferences? Sandra glanced at Cameron and Dylan, seeing them not as the 2 young black men she had profiled and dismissed, but as the billionaire technology executives whose company literally controlled whether Global Air aircraft could take off or remain grounded indefinitely. I'm beginning to understand, Sandra whispered, her career flashing before her eyes. I don't think you understand at all, Victoria replied, her voice carrying decades of experience dealing with corporate disasters that required immediate damage control. You have discriminated against Cameron and Dylan Cross, the founders and majority owners of Quantum Logistics AI, the company that provides 93% of North American aviation logistics, including 100% of Global Air's operational systems. The words hit Sandra like physical blows, each revelation making her situation worse than she could have imagined possible. Around her, passengers were pulling out phones to record her public destruction, while social media began exploding with hashtags about discrimination and corporate accountability. Furthermore, Victoria continued relentlessly, "Mr. Cross has just informed me that our aircraft is currently grounded due to safety protocols triggered by discriminatory crew behavior, which means you haven't just embarrassed our company. You've created an operational crisis that affects hundreds of passengers and potential legal liability in the millions of dollars." Theodore Worthington III chose that moment to press his call button, demanding attention with the oblivious entitlement of someone who still believed his social status insulated him from consequences. "Excuse me," he called out loudly. "When are we going to resolve this delay? I have important business in London." Victoria's voice came through the phone loud enough for Theodore to hear clearly. "Mr. Worthington, I presume I'm Victoria Ashford, CEO of Global Air. Your important business in London will have to wait while I deal with the discrimination lawsuit that your demands have just created for my company." Theodore's face went from red to pale as he realized the conversation he was overhearing involved the airline's chief executive officer, discrimination lawsuits, and his own role in creating what was obviously a corporate crisis. Lawsuit. Theodore stammered, his previous confidence evaporating as he began to understand the magnitude of what his entitlement had triggered. "I simply requested proper seating arrangements. There's nothing discriminatory about expecting appropriate service levels." "Mr. Worthington." Victoria's voice carried the kind of legal precision that comes from consulting with corporate attorneys for 20 years. "You demanded that confirmed first-class passengers be moved to economy class to accommodate your personal preferences, and my employee complied with your request by targeting passengers based on racial profiling rather than legitimate service protocols." Alex Chen's livestream viewer count had exploded past 50,000. As word spread across social media about billionaire tech founders being racially profiled by airline staff, then using their own company's systems to ground the aircraft and expose the discrimination to the airline's CEO in real time. Cameron reached for his phone, which Sandra returned with the defeated expression of someone who understood her career was over, but hoped to minimize the damage to her personal life and future employment prospects. Victoria Cameron said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had just proven his point beyond any possible argument. "I appreciate you taking this call and addressing the situation directly. This kind of executive accountability is exactly what the aviation industry needs to prevent similar incidents." Cameron Victoria replied, "Please accept my personal apology and the company's commitment to comprehensive review and reform of our customer service policies. Ms. Blackwood's employment with Global Air is terminated effective immediately, and I want to discuss appropriate compensation for the discrimination you've experienced." Sandra felt her knees buckle slightly as the words sank in. 20 years of career advancement gone in a single phone conversation because she had made assumptions based on appearance, rather than taking 30 seconds to verify passenger credentials. "That's unnecessary," Cameron said, looking around the aircraft at passengers who were recording every moment of the conversation. "What happened here isn't about individual punishment, it's about institutional change. We don't want employees fired. We want airlines trained to treat all passengers with equal dignity regardless of their appearance or perceived social status." Nevertheless, Victoria said firmly, Ms. Blackwood's decision to prioritize racial profiling over customer service cannot be overlooked. Her termination stands and will be conducting comprehensive reviews of all crew members involved in this incident. Theodore Worthington III stood up from seat 2A with the defeated posture of someone who had just realized his demand for special treatment had cost people their jobs and created a corporate scandal that would follow him for the rest of his life. "I think," Theodore said quietly, addressing Cameron and Dylan directly, For the first time, I owe you an apology. I let my assumptions and expectations override basic human decency, and I'm sorry for the role I played in this situation." Cameron looked at Theodore for a long moment, seeing not the entitled billionaire who had triggered the crisis, but a man beginning to understand the consequences of his own privilege and prejudice. "Apology accepted," Cameron said simply. "Now let's see if we can turn this into a learning experience that makes air travel better for everyone." Alex Chen's livestream had become the most watched real-time event on social media, as viewers worldwide witnessed billionaire tech founders systematically dismantling airline discrimination using their own company's technology, and the hashtag Quantum Justice was trending globally alongside hashtag Flying While Black and hashtag Airline Accountability. The aircraft cabin had transformed into an impromptu theater, where hundreds of passengers watched corporate executives face immediate consequences for decisions that would have been quietly swept aside under normal circumstances. Phone cameras captured every moment as Sandra Blackwood gathered her belongings with the defeated expression of someone whose life had just changed forever, while Theodore Worthington III sat in stunned silence, contemplating the social and professional wreckage his entitlement had created. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Victoria Ashford announced over the intercom, her voice carrying the professional authority of someone who had spent decades managing crisis situations. "I want to personally apologize for the unacceptable treatment that some of our passengers experienced today. Global Air is committed to serving all customers with dignity and respect, and we are taking immediate action to address the discriminatory behavior you witnessed." Cameron stood up in the cramped economy section, his presence somehow commanding attention throughout the entire aircraft, despite his distance from the premium cabin where the discrimination had begun. "Captain Ashford," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed cabin, "I appreciate your company's quick response and accountability. However, I think all passengers deserve to understand exactly what happened here and what changes will prevent similar situations in the future." "Absolutely," Captain Ashford replied immediately. "Mr. Cross, would you be willing to address your fellow passengers directly? I think they deserve to hear from someone who understands both the technology and the human impact of what occurred today." Alex continued live streaming as Cameron walked from economy class toward the front of the aircraft, passing hundreds of passengers who were beginning to understand they had witnessed something unprecedented in commercial aviation history. The cameras followed him as he moved from the cramped, noisy environment of economy seating to the spacious luxury of first class, a journey that had taken on symbolic meaning far beyond simple aircraft geography. "My name is Cameron Cross." He began, his voice carrying easily throughout the cabin as passengers strained to hear every word. "Along with my brother Dylan, I founded Quantum Logistics AI, the company that provides scheduling and safety systems for most commercial aviation in North America, including Global Air." He paused, letting that information settle among passengers who were beginning to realize they had witnessed discrimination against someone with unprecedented power to expose and address such treatment. "Today, my brother and I purchased first-class tickets for legitimate business travel to London. We were moved to economy class not because of overbooking mechanical issues or weather delays, but because a flight attendant decided we didn't look like appropriate first-class passengers and chose to accommodate someone she considered more suitable for premium service. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the ambient sounds of aircraft systems and the soft whir of phone cameras recording what was becoming a historic moment in civil rights and corporate accountability. When we complained about this treatment, we were threatened with removal from the aircraft for being disruptive. When we provided evidence of our legitimate reservations, we were told that customer service hierarchy justified moving us to accommodate passenger preferences. When we asked for equal treatment, we were accused of signal interference and security threats." Cameron looked around the cabin, making eye contact with passengers who represented every demographic that used commercial aviation: families traveling to visit relatives, business travelers rushing to important meetings, students heading to study abroad, programs, elderly couples celebrating anniversaries in foreign countries. Every person on this aircraft paid for respectful treatment as part of their ticket price. Cameron continued, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had spent years fighting for systematic change through technology innovation. When airlines discriminate against any passenger, they violate the trust that makes air travel possible for everyone. Dylan joined his brother at the front of the cabin, and together they represented the kind of quiet authority that comes from understanding complex systems well enough to change them completely. We used our company's safety systems to ground this aircraft, because discriminatory crew behavior represents a genuine safety risk. Dylan explained, his voice carrying the technical precision that had made him one of the youngest chief technology officers in Silicon Valley history. When crew members make decisions based on prejudice rather than protocols, they compromise the judgment and professionalism that keeps aviation safe for millions of passengers. Alex's livestream viewer count had climbed past 100,000 as major news outlets began picking up the story, and social media amplified the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding in real time. Comments flooded in from viewers sharing their own experiences with airline discrimination, while aviation industry professionals debated the implications of passengers using technology systems to enforce civil rights compliance. Theodore Worthington III stood up slowly from seat 2. His previous arrogance replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse mixed with dawning understanding of the consequences his actions would have on his personal and professional reputation. Mr. Cross. Theodore said, his voice carrying none of his earlier condescension. I want to publicly apologize not just to you and your brother, but to every passenger who witnessed my behavior today. I let my assumptions and sense of entitlement override basic human decency, and I take full responsibility for my role in creating this situation. The apology was awkward and obviously difficult for someone unaccustomed to acknowledging his mistakes, but it carried the authenticity of someone beginning to understand how his privilege had affected others throughout his life. I also want to thank you. Theodore continued, his voice growing stronger as he found words for concepts he had never articulated before, for showing me that wealth and social position don't justify treating other people as less deserving of respect and dignity. I have a lot to learn about how my behavior affects others, and I'm committed to doing that learning. Cameron nodded acknowledgement of the apology, recognizing the courage it took for someone like Theodore to admit fault publicly and commit to personal change. This isn't about individual punishment or public humiliation, Cameron said, addressing Theodore, but speaking to the entire aircraft and the thousands of viewers watching online. This is about creating systems that protect everyone's dignity and ensure that discrimination becomes impossible rather than simply discouraged. Speaking of systems, Dylan added with a slight smile that suggested the technological demonstration was far from over, we should probably allow this aircraft to continue to London so all these passengers can reach their destinations on time. Cameron pulled out his phone, accessing the same interface he had used to ground the aircraft 3 hours earlier. Quantum Logistics Platform. This is Administrative Override Authority. Cameron Cross. Safety review completed. Crew discrimination. Addressed executive accountability confirmed. Clear flight. 847 for immediate departure with priority routing to London Heathrow. The response was immediate. Aircraft systems came online, engines began their startup sequence, and captain announcements indicated normal departure procedures would resume within minutes. Alex Chen's livestream had become the most watched real-time social justice event in social media history, demonstrating how technology, courage, and strategic thinking could create immediate accountability for discrimination while inspiring millions of viewers to expect better treatment in their own lives. Within 48 hours of Alex Chen's livestream reaching viral status with over 10 million views across multiple platforms, Cameron and Dylan Cross had received contact from 17 of the nation's top civil rights law firms, all offering to represent them in what legal experts were already calling the most significant airline discrimination case since the Civil Rights Act. The twins sat in the Manhattan offices of Richardson and Associates, the premier civil rights firm that had won landmark cases against corporations, government agencies, and educational institutions over 3 decades of fighting institutional bias. Senior partner Maria Richardson, a woman whose courtroom victories had changed laws and saved lives, spread documents across a conference table that overlooked Central Park through floor-to-ceiling windows. "I've been practicing civil rights law for 35 years, Maria said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court and won, and I have never seen a case with this much documented evidence, social media validation, and corporate admission of wrongdoing." Sandra Blackwood's discrimination was captured on video, witnessed by hundreds of passengers, and acknowledged by Global Air's CEO on a recorded phone call. Dylan leaned forward, studying legal briefs that outlined potential damages, precedent cases, and strategic options for pursuing justice through federal courts. "We're not interested in personal financial gain from this situation," he said, his voice carrying the same focused intensity he brought to complex technical problems. "We want institutional change that prevents similar discrimination against passengers who don't have our resources or platform to fight back." "That's exactly why this case is so important," Maria replied, pointing to a section of federal aviation regulations that most passengers never knew existed. "The Department of Transportation has clear anti-discrimination guidelines for airlines, but enforcement has been inconsistent because victims rarely have the resources to pursue lengthy legal battles against corporate defendants." Cameron examined photographs from the incident images captured by passengers that showed the contrast between their treatment and the preferential service provided to Theodore Worthington III. "What kind of institutional changes can we realistically achieve through litigation?" "Comprehensive ones," Maria said, pulling up a presentation that outlined their legal strategy. "We're not just suing Global Air for monetary damages. We're seeking a consent decree that requires industry-wide policy changes, mandatory bias training for all airline personnel, federal oversight of customer service practices, and civil rights monitoring systems." The legal documents painted a picture of discrimination that went far beyond a single incident, revealing patterns of biased treatment that had affected thousands of passengers over years of unchecked airline authority. Maria's team had already uncovered internal emails, training materials, and customer service guidelines that suggested Sandra Blackwood's behavior was symptomatic of broader cultural problems within the aviation industry. Furthermore, Maria continued, "We're coordinating with the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Enforcement and Proceedings to ensure this case creates regulatory changes rather than simply private settlement agreements." Secretary Patricia Williams has already announced a comprehensive review of civil rights compliance across all major carriers. Dylan's phone buzzed with notifications from social media, where #QuantumJustice continued trending as people shared their own stories of airline discrimination and demanded accountability from companies that had treated customer complaints as public relations problems rather than civil rights violations. "The social media response has been unprecedented," Dylan observed, scrolling through thousands of comments from passengers who had experienced similar treatment but lacked the resources or platform to seek justice. "People are sharing stories that demonstrate this isn't isolated behavior, it's embedded culture." Maria nodded, having seen similar patterns in cases involving discrimination across multiple industries. "That's why we're pursuing this as a class action lawsuit rather than individual damages." "Your experience represents the treatment that countless passengers have endured without recourse, and your platform gives voice to victims who have been ignored for decades." Cameron studied financial documents that showed Global Air's stock price had dropped 18% since Alex's livestream went viral, while Quantum Logistics had gained 12%, as investors recognized the power of companies that prioritized ethical behavior alongside technological innovation. "The market is already responding," Cameron noted. understanding that financial pressure often motivated corporate change more effectively than legal settlements. Global Air is facing boycotts, regulatory scrutiny, and competition from airlines that are implementing bias prevention policies to differentiate themselves. Which brings us to settlement discussions, Maria said, sliding a folder across the table that contained preliminary offers from Global Air's legal team. They want to resolve this quickly and quietly, which suggests they're worried about discovery revealing more extensive discrimination patterns. The settlement offers were substantial, ranging from $50 million in damages to comprehensive policy reforms that would affect how Global Air treated passengers across all routes and service levels. But the twins weren't interested in quiet resolution of public discrimination that had been witnessed by millions of people worldwide. "We want this case to go to trial," Cameron said firmly. "Settlement negotiations should focus on institutional changes rather than financial compensation. We want federal oversight, mandatory training, civil rights monitoring, and legal precedent that other discrimination victims can use in their own cases. Public trials create public accountability," Dillon added, recognizing that courtroom proceedings would maintain media attention and social pressure for industry-wide changes. Private settlements allow companies to buy their way out of discrimination without acknowledging wrongdoing or implementing meaningful reforms. Maria smiled, recognizing clients who understood that legal victories could create social change beyond individual justice. "I was hoping you would say that. Public trials also allow us to use discovery to expose discrimination patterns across the entire industry, not just Global Air's specific practices." Over the following weeks, the legal machinery of civil rights enforcement began processing the Cross case through federal courts, while regulatory agencies launched investigations that would affect policies across the aviation industry. The Department of Transportation opened formal proceedings against Global Air and announced comprehensive reviews of customer service practices at all major carriers. Congressional representatives called for hearings on airline discrimination, while state attorneys general from 12 states joined the federal investigation to ensure consistent enforcement of civil rights protections across all forms of commercial transportation. Alex Chen, whose live stream had captured the original discrimination and corporate response, found himself testifying before the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee about social media's role in documenting civil rights violations and holding corporations accountable for employee behavior. Technology has given ordinary people the power to demand extraordinary accountability, Alex told congressional representatives who were struggling to understand how a college student's phone camera had triggered industry-wide reform. When discrimination happens in public spaces, social media ensures it receives public response rather than private settlement. The legal process was creating exactly the kind of comprehensive change that Cameron and Dillon had sought, not just individual justice but institutional reform that would protect future passengers from experiencing the discrimination they had endured and overcome through strategic thinking, technological expertise, and the courage to fight back against embedded bias. 6 weeks after the incident, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee's hearing room was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, aviation industry executives, and passengers who had traveled from across the country to witness what many considered the most significant civil rights hearing related to commercial aviation in decades. Cameron and Dillon Cross sat at the witness table flanked by their legal team and facing a panel of congressional representatives who understood they were addressing discrimination that affected millions of Americans but had rarely received sustained public attention or legislative response. Mr. Cross said Representative Angela Martinez, the committee chairwoman, whose own experiences with airline discrimination had motivated her to pursue comprehensive reform. "Your case has exposed patterns of bias that appear to extend far beyond a single incident or even a single airline. Can you help this committee understand the scope of discrimination in commercial aviation?" Cameron leaned toward the microphone, his voice carrying the same calm authority he had used when confronting Sandra Blackwood on the aircraft. "Representative Martinez, What happened to my brother and me was documented because we had the resources and platform to demand accountability. But our legal team has received over 3,000 similar complaints from passengers who experienced comparable discrimination without any recourse or resolution. Dylan pulled out a tablet displaying data visualizations that showed discrimination patterns across multiple airlines' routes and passenger demographics. We've been analyzing complaint data, social media reports, and internal airline communications obtained through discovery. The evidence shows that bias in passenger treatment is widespread, consistent, and largely ignored by industry oversight. Representative James Thompson, a former airline pilot who had experienced discrimination early in his aviation career, studied the data with the expertise of someone who understood both the technical and human aspects of commercial flight operations. This data suggests that discrimination isn't isolated behavior by individual employees, but embedded practices that airlines have tolerated or even encouraged through training and customer service policies, Representative Thompson observed. What changes would prevent similar incidents while maintaining operational efficiency? We've developed a comprehensive technology solution, Cameron replied, gesturing toward documents that outlined the bias prevention systems Quantum Logistics had designed specifically for aviation customer service. Blind booking protocols that hide passenger demographic information during service interactions, automated monitoring systems that flag discriminatory patterns, and real-time civil rights compliance tracking that provides transparent accountability. The technology solutions were revolutionary in their simplicity. Instead of allowing airline employees to make service decisions based on passenger appearance names or perceived social status, the systems would present only service-relevant information such as ticket class special needs requests and flight connection requirements. Representative Martinez examined the technical specifications with the understanding of someone who had spent years fighting discrimination across multiple industries. Would these systems eliminate discrimination entirely, or simply make it more difficult to implement? No system eliminates human bias completely, Dylan admitted, recognizing the limitations of technological solutions to cultural problems. But these systems make discrimination visible, trackable, and immediately actionable rather than hidden, deniable, and consequence-free. Alex Chen, now recognized as a civil rights advocate whose documentary skills had exposed corporate discrimination to global audiences, testified about social media's role in creating accountability for behavior that had previously been invisible to public oversight. Before live streaming and social media documentation, Alex told the committee passengers who experienced discrimination had to file complaints with airlines that investigated themselves and usually found no wrongdoing. Now, discriminatory behavior can be witnessed by millions of people in real time, creating immediate pressure for corporate accountability and policy changes. The congressional hearing was being broadcast live across multiple networks and streaming platforms, reaching audiences who were beginning to understand that airline discrimination reflected broader social issues that affected education, healthcare, employment, and housing, in addition to transportation. Theodore Worthington III had requested permission to testify, hoping to demonstrate personal growth and institutional change that could emerge from confronting privilege and prejudice directly, rather than defending or denying their existence. Representatives, Theodore said, his voice carrying humility that would have been impossible for him. 6 weeks earlier, I came to this hearing to acknowledge my role in perpetuating discrimination and to support reforms that prevent other passengers from experiencing the treatment that my entitled behavior made possible. His testimony was awkward but authentic, describing the process of recognizing how his assumptions about appropriate passenger treatment had contributed to bias that affected people who couldn't fight back with his resources or social position. I've begun working with civil rights organizations to understand how privilege creates discrimination, even when that's not the conscious intention. Theodore continued, I want my mistakes to contribute to positive changes rather than just personal embarrassment. The hearing concluded with unanimous committee support for comprehensive airline discrimination reforms, including mandatory bias training, federal oversight of customer service practices, civil rights monitoring systems, and legal protections for passengers who documented discriminatory treatment. Representative Martinez announced that the committee would draft legislation creating the Commercial Aviation Civil Rights Act, landmark federal law, that would establish clear anti-discrimination standards for all forms of commercial transportation, while providing enforcement mechanisms that previous regulations had lacked. The Cross case has demonstrated that discrimination in commercial aviation reflects broader social inequities that require comprehensive response rather than isolated incident management, Representative Martinez said in her closing statement. This committee is committed to ensuring that air travel serves all Americans with equal dignity and respect. The legislation would create federal oversight positions specifically focused on transportation. Civil rights establish whistleblower protections for employees who reported discriminatory practices and require airlines to implement bias prevention technologies as conditions for operating certificates. In the weeks following the hearing, other transportation companies began implementing similar bias prevention systems to avoid the kind of public accountability that had transformed Global Air from industry leader to cautionary example of corporate discrimination. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation as hotels, restaurants, retail companies, and service industries recognized that social media documentation could expose their own discriminatory practices to similar public scrutiny and regulatory response. Cameron and Dylan had achieved something unprecedented. They had used personal experience with discrimination to create institutional change that would protect millions of future travelers, while demonstrating how technology, legal strategy, and social media could combine to enforce civil rights more effectively than traditional complaint and regulatory processes. The case had proven that discrimination was vulnerable to strategic response when victims had resources, platform, and determination to fight back against embedded bias through comprehensive accountability rather than quiet settlement and private resolution. The unemployment office in Queens felt like the end of the world to Sandra Blackwood, who sat in a plastic chair that reminded her of everything she had lost when a single phone conversation had ended her 20-year career in aviation. The other people waiting for assistance looked tired, defeated, and forgotten by an economy that discarded workers who made visible mistakes rather than hidden ones. Sandra's fall had been swift and comprehensive. After her termination from Global Air, every major airline had blacklisted her from employment due to the viral video that had made her face synonymous with workplace discrimination. Hotel chains, cruise lines, and service companies had rejected her applications once background checks revealed her connection to the most watched civil rights incident in social media history. She worked nights at a discount retail store, now stocking shelves and cleaning bathrooms for $12 an hour while trying to rebuild a life that had been completely destroyed by assumptions she had never examined and prejudices she had never acknowledged. The work was honest but humiliating for someone who had once supervised VIP lounges and managed premium passenger experiences. Next called the employment counselor, a tired woman who dealt with dozens of displaced workers every day, most of whom had lost jobs through economic forces beyond their control rather than personal decisions that had triggered national conversations about discrimination and accountability. Sandra gathered her paperwork and walked to the desk where she would once again explain why her previous employment had ended and why finding new work had become nearly impossible. The counselor looked at her file, then at the computer screen, then back at Sandra with the expression of someone trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. "Ms. Blackwood," the counselor said carefully, "I have to ask about this employment gap and the circumstances surrounding your departure from Global Air. Most employers are going to conduct background checks that will reveal the incident that led to your termination." "I understand," Sandra replied, her voice carrying the defeated tone of someone who had explained this situation dozens of times to potential employers who quickly ended interviews once they realized who she was. "I made assumptions about passengers based on their appearance, and I acted on those assumptions in a way that discriminated against legitimate customers. I take full responsibility for my behavior. The counselor had dealt with workers fired for theft attendance problems and performance issues, but discrimination cases that had triggered federal legislation and industry-wide reform were outside her normal experience. Have you considered training or education programs that might help you transition to different career fields? Sandra had spent 6 months applying to jobs in industries far from aviation and hospitality, hoping to find employers who might overlook her notoriety in exchange for her work ethic and customer service experience. But the viral video had made her face recognizable to millions of people, and most companies couldn't risk the negative publicity associated with hiring someone known for discriminatory behavior. I've been accepted into a community college program for social work, Sandra said, pulling out acceptance letters that represented her attempt to rebuild her life through service, rather than the customer management role that had destroyed her career. I want to work with people who have experienced discrimination and help them access resources and support. It was honest work motivated by genuine desire to understand and address the harm her behavior had caused, but it would require 2 years of full-time study while supporting herself through part-time employment that barely covered basic living expenses. Meanwhile, across the country in a federal courtroom in San Francisco, Theodore Worthington III sat in the defendant's chair facing charges that went far beyond airline discrimination to encompass fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement that had been uncovered when his business practices received scrutiny following the viral incident. The investigation that began with his demanding special airline treatment had revealed decades of financial crimes that had cost investors millions of dollars and employees their retirement savings. His sense of entitlement that had been so obvious on the aircraft had extended to corporate management, where he had treated company funds as personal resources and shareholder investments as family inheritance. Mr. Worthington, the federal prosecutor said, addressing a man who looked decades older than he had 6 months earlier, your airline behavior was merely the tip of an iceberg of privilege that allowed you to steal from workers, investors, and business partners for over 15 years. Theodore's legal team had negotiated a plea agreement that would send him to federal prison for 8 years while requiring restitution of $47 million to victims of his financial crimes. His family's shipping fortune had been frozen pending civil litigation from hundreds of investors who had trusted him with their savings and retirement security. The once arrogant heir who had demanded first-class treatment from airline staff was now a convicted felon facing years in federal prison, while his wife had divorced him and his children had legally changed their names to distance themselves from his disgrace. But the most significant changes were happening in the aviation industry itself, where the Cross case had triggered comprehensive reforms that were transforming how airlines trained employees, treated passengers, and handled discrimination complaints. Global Air had implemented the bias prevention technology that Quantum Logistics developed, creating blind booking systems that hid passenger demographic information while providing service-relevant details about tickets' preferences and special needs. Customer service interactions were monitored by artificial intelligence that flagged potential discrimination patterns for immediate human review and resolution. Similar systems had been adopted by every major airline as federal regulations required bias prevention technology as a condition for operating certificates. The Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Civil Rights, created in response to the Cross case, conducted random audits and investigated passenger complaints with the kind of thoroughness that had been missing from previous oversight efforts. Alex Chen had leveraged his role in documenting the original discrimination into a career as a civil rights advocate and documentary filmmaker, traveling to colleges and conferences to speak about social media's power to create accountability for institutional bias. His livestream had become a case study taught in journalism, civil rights, and business ethics courses across the country. The technology exists to prevent discrimination, Alex told audiences, who were learning how individual courage could trigger systematic change. But it only works when people are willing to document injustice and demand accountability, rather than accepting unfair treatment as inevitable. The ripple effects had extended far beyond aviation, as other service industries implemented similar bias prevention systems to avoid the kind of public accountability that had destroyed careers and triggered federal oversight. Hotels, restaurants, retail companies, and healthcare organizations recognized that social media documentation could expose their discriminatory practices to similar scrutiny and regulatory response. The Cross case had proven that discrimination was vulnerable to strategic thinking, technological solutions, and social media accountability when victims had the resources and determination to fight back comprehensively rather than seeking quiet resolution of public injustice. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that individual incidents of discrimination could be transformed into institutional reform that protected millions of people from similar treatment while creating lasting change that extended far beyond the original victims. The Lincoln Center Theater buzzed with anticipation as celebrities, activists, civil rights leaders, and aviation industry executives gathered for the premiere of Seats of Justice, the Cross Brothers story, a documentary that had transformed a viral social media incident into a comprehensive examination of discrimination, privilege, and the power of strategic resistance. Cameron and Dylan Cross arrived at the red carpet wearing elegant suits that reflected their evolution from tech entrepreneurs to reluctant civil rights icons whose personal experience had triggered industry-wide reform. Photographers captured them alongside other honorees who had used their platforms to advance social justice, while reporters asked questions about the lasting impact of their decision to fight back against airline discrimination. "This documentary isn't just about what happened to us on one flight," Cameron told a CNN correspondent who was broadcasting live from the premiere. "It's about how individual courage can create institutional change when people refuse to accept discrimination as normal business practice." The film itself was a masterpiece of documentary storytelling that wove together the original incident, congressional hearings, industry reforms, and personal transformation stories to demonstrate how a single moment of injustice had created ripple effects across multiple sectors of American society. Director Maria Santos had spent 8 months interviewing passengers, airline employees, civil rights attorneys, and federal regulators to create a narrative that showed both the human cost of discrimination and the systematic changes needed to address embedded bias in service industries. The documentary opened with Alex Chen's original livestream footage, allowing audiences to witness the discrimination in real time before exploring the broader context that had made such treatment possible and the strategic response that had transformed it into accountability and reform. What made this case unprecedented, explained civil rights attorney Sarah Williams in the film, was that the victims had both the resources to fight back and the technological expertise to create immediate consequences for discriminatory behavior, rather than relying on traditional complaint processes that airlines had learned to ignore or minimize. The film showed Sandra Blackwood in a candid interview where she discussed her rehabilitation process, the assumptions that had guided her discriminatory behavior, and her current work with civil rights organizations to train service industry employees about unconscious bias and its impact on customer treatment. "I spent 20 years in aviation believing I was providing excellent customer service," Sandra said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse and hard-earned understanding. "I never realized that my definition of appropriate customer service was shaped by prejudices that discriminated against passengers who didn't match my expectations about wealth status and belonging." Her interview was difficult to watch, but necessary for understanding how discrimination operated through people who considered themselves professional and fair-minded, while implementing bias that affected thousands of passengers who lacked the resources or platform to demand accountability. The documentary also featured Theodore Worthington III in a prison interview, where he discussed the process of confronting privilege that had allowed him to treat other people as less deserving of respect and dignity. "My behavior on that flight was embarrassing, but it revealed character flaws that had affected my business practices, family relationships, and community involvement for decades," Theodore said, wearing the orange jumpsuit that had replaced his expensive suits. "I'm grateful that my mistakes became public enough to force me to examine and change behavior," that I had never recognized as harmful. The most powerful segment focused on the systematic changes that had emerged from the Cross case, showing bias prevention technology being implemented across multiple industries, while federal oversight created accountability for discrimination that had previously been consequence-free. Dr. Patricia Williams, Secretary of Transportation, explained how the case had revealed gaps in civil rights enforcement that affected millions of travelers. The Cross case proved that discrimination in commercial transportation was widespread but invisible to regulatory oversight, because victims rarely had the resources to pursue lengthy legal battles against corporate defendants. The film showed congressional hearings, federal regulations, and industry reforms that had created comprehensive change, extending far beyond aviation to encompass hotels, restaurants, healthcare, and other service sectors where bias prevention technology was becoming standard practice. Alex Chen appeared throughout the documentary as both witness and participant, explaining how social media had transformed individual discrimination incidents into public accountability that traditional complaint processes had failed to provide. Before live streaming and viral documentation, Alex told audiences passengers who experienced discrimination had to convince airlines to investigate themselves, and usually found no wrongdoing. Now, discriminatory behavior can be witnessed by millions of people who demand immediate corporate response and systematic reform. The film's climax focused on the emotional impact of transformation rather than technical details of policy changes, showing how personal experiences with discrimination had motivated comprehensive reform that protected future travelers from similar treatment. Cameron and Dylan appeared together in the final interview, reflecting on how their mother's death from denied health care had prepared them to recognize and resist discrimination in other contexts. "Our mother died because insurance companies decided her life wasn't worth the cost of proper treatment," Cameron said, his voice carrying pain that had motivated decades of work for systematic change. "When airlines decided we weren't worth first-class treatment, we used our platform to ensure other passengers wouldn't experience similar discrimination. The technology exists to prevent bias from affecting customer service," Dylan added. "Our case proved that discrimination is vulnerable to strategic response when people refuse to accept unfair treatment and have the resources to demand comprehensive accountability." The documentary concluded with footage of diverse passengers using airlines that had implemented bias prevention systems, showing respectful treatment that had become standard practice rather than exceptional service, deserving special recognition. As credits rolled, the Lincoln Center audience rose in sustained applause that reflected understanding of how individual courage had created institutional change, benefiting millions of people who would never know their travel experiences had been improved by the Cross brothers' decision to fight back against discrimination. The film had achieved something unprecedented in civil rights documentary filmmaking. It had shown how personal injustice could be transformed into systematic reform through strategic thinking, technological expertise, and the courage to demand accountability rather than accepting quiet settlement of public discrimination. Critics would later describe Seats of Justice as essential viewing for understanding how individual acts of resistance could create lasting social change when victims had the resources and determination to pursue comprehensive accountability rather than personal compensation. The documentary sparked conversations about discrimination across multiple industries, while inspiring activism among viewers who recognized that bias prevention technology and social media accountability had created new tools for enforcing civil rights more effectively than traditional complaint and regulatory processes. 2 years after the incident that had changed their lives and transformed an industry, Cameron and Dylan Cross stood in the quiet cemetery where their mother Elena rested beneath a simple granite headstone that now bore fresh flowers and a small plaque reading Elena Cross Memorial Scholarship for Aviation Excellence, awarded annually to students committed to civil rights and technological innovation. The scholarship had been established using proceeds from their discrimination lawsuit settlement, creating educational opportunities for students who might not otherwise have access to aviation technology programs while honoring their mother's memory through commitments to equality and justice. "I think she would be proud of what came from all this," Cameron said, placing the 2 first-class boarding passes they brought every year on the anniversary of the incident. The tickets were symbolic reminders of their promise that her sons would never again accept being treated as less than they deserved, while ensuring others wouldn't experience similar discrimination. Dylan knelt beside the headstone, brushing away leaves that had fallen from nearby oak trees. "She always said we should use our gifts to solve problems that affected people who didn't have our advantages. I think we finally figured out how to do that." The quiet cemetery visit was a private ritual that grounded their public work in personal motivation, reminding them that civil rights victories required both strategic thinking and emotional commitment to justice that extended beyond individual benefit to systematic change. They had each found personal happiness alongside their professional success and activist work. Cameron had married Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a civil rights attorney who specialized in transportation discrimination cases, while Dylan had partnered with Alex Chen, whose documentary work had become a powerful force for exposing bias across multiple industries. The Quantum Logistics Office had expanded to include a civil rights technology division that developed bias prevention systems for industries ranging from healthcare to housing, creating tools that made discrimination visible and actionable, rather than hidden and consequence-free. "We're processing over 50,000 bias prevention alerts monthly across all our client systems," Dylan explained during their weekly review of civil rights technology implementation. "Most are resolved through automated training recommendations, but the ones requiring human intervention are decreasing as people learn that discriminatory behavior triggers immediate accountability." The technology had evolved beyond simple prevention to include predictive analytics that identified discrimination patterns before they affected customers, allowing companies to address bias through training and policy changes rather than waiting for incident-based complaints. Alex Chen had become their most trusted collaborator, documenting implementation of bias prevention systems while creating educational content that helped companies understand both the moral and business cases for eliminating discrimination from customer service practices. The cost of preventing discrimination is always lower than the cost of defending it. Alex told business conferences where he presented data showing improved customer satisfaction, reduced legal liability, and enhanced reputation among companies that had implemented comprehensive bias prevention systems. His work had expanded from live streaming individual incidents to producing documentary series that showed how discrimination operated across different industries, while highlighting success stories of companies that had committed to fundamental reform. Sandra Blackwood had completed her social work degree and was now employed by a nonprofit organization that provided support services for discrimination victims, helping people navigate legal systems and access resources while healing from traumatic experiences with bias and prejudice. Her transformation had been genuine and comprehensive, motivated by understanding the harm her behavior had caused, while channeling that recognition into service for people who had experienced similar treatment without the resources or platform to demand accountability. "I speak at airline training sessions now," Sandra told a conference of customer service professionals who were learning about unconscious bias and its impact on passenger treatment. "I help employees understand how assumptions based on appearance can lead to discriminatory behavior that violates both company policies and customer rights." Her work was difficult but necessary, providing credible testimony about how discrimination operated through people who considered themselves professional while implementing bias that affected thousands of customers who couldn't fight back effectively. Theodore Worthington III remained in federal prison, but had begun corresponding with civil rights organizations about his transformation process and the systematic privileges that had enabled his harmful behavior for decades. His letters were part of a broader effort to understand how wealth and social position could insulate people from consequences while enabling them to treat others as less deserving of respect and dignity. The aviation industry had been completely transformed by reforms triggered by the Cross case, with bias prevention technology now standard across all major carriers and federal oversight, ensuring consistent enforcement of civil rights protections. The Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Civil Rights had investigated over 3,000 discrimination complaints, resulting in policy changes, employee training, and financial penalties that had created powerful incentives for respectful passenger treatment. We've moved from an industry where discrimination was tolerated if it remained invisible to one where bias prevention is essential for operational certification, explained Dr. Patricia Williams during her congressional testimony reviewing 3 years of aviation civil rights enforcement. Similar changes had spread across other service industries as companies recognized that social media documentation and federal oversight had created new levels of accountability for employee behavior that affected customers differently based on race, gender, age, or perceived social status. Hotels, restaurants, healthcare systems, and retail companies had implemented bias prevention technology while training employees about unconscious bias and its impact on customer service quality and company reputation. The Cross case had established legal precedent that was being used by discrimination victims across multiple industries, creating a body of civil rights law that extended far beyond transportation to encompass any business that served the public. Individual courage can create institutional change, Cameron told audiences at civil rights conferences, where he spoke about strategic response to discrimination. But it requires commitment to comprehensive accountability rather than personal compensation and willingness to transform private injustice into public education about bias and its impact. Their work had demonstrated that discrimination was vulnerable to strategic thinking, technological solutions, and sustained advocacy when victims had the resources and determination to pursue systematic reform rather than quiet settlement of public bias. As they prepared to board their flight to London for the 5th anniversary commemoration of the incident that had changed their lives, Cameron and Dylan reflected on how a moment of discrimination had been transformed into a movement for justice that had protected millions of people from similar treatment. The first-class cabin that welcomed them now reflected the changes they had fought to create diverse passengers being served with equal dignity. Crew members trained to recognize and prevent bias and technology systems that made discrimination visible and immediately actionable. The young black girl sitting comfortably in seat 1A working on homework while her parents reviewed business documents nearby represented the future they had worked to create: air travel that served all passengers with respect regardless of their appearance, age, or perceived social status. "This is what justice looks like," Dylan said quietly, watching the child focus on her studies with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Cameron nodded, touching his wallet where their mother's hospital bill remained as a reminder of their ongoing commitment to ensuring that systems served everyone equally, rather than discriminating based on arbitrary judgments about worth and belonging. 5 years later, the quantum protocols for bias-free service became industry standard across all major airlines and extended to hotels, restaurants, and healthcare systems worldwide. Sandra Blackwood completed her rehabilitation program and now directs bias prevention training for transportation workers, while Theodore Worthington III remains in federal prison, but has become an advocate for prison reform and white-collar crime accountability. Cameron and Dylan Cross were named among Time magazine's most influential people, not for their technology success, but for proving that justice and dignity are not privileges to be earned, but rights to be protected through strategic resistance to discrimination. Alex Chen graduated summa cum laude and now leads the Quantum Civil Rights Technology Initiative, developing bias prevention systems for industries serving millions of customers daily. At their mother's grave each year, the twins leave 2 first-class boarding passes as a promise kept that her sons would never again accept being treated as less than they deserve, while ensuring no one else would have to endure discrimination when courage, technology, and determination combine to demand accountability. Sometimes the smallest act of standing up creates the biggest change, transforming individual injustice into institutional reform that protects countless others from experiencing similar harm. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Share your thoughts about how standing up to discrimination has changed your own perspective. Together, we can build a world where dignity and respect are guaranteed for everyone, one act of courage at a time.